Welcome back to this new episode of the Computational Antitrust podcast. My name is Thibault Schrepel. I am a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center, an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam, and the creator of the Computational Antitrust project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project brings together over 75 competition agencies and about 50 academics on the advisory board. Every month or so, we publish an academic article on the subject of computational antitrust. You can find all of these publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today's guest is Nancy Scola, a longtime technology and politics journalist whose reporting has appeared in Politico, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Wired, and other leading outlets. In today's conversation, Nancy and I talk about the ways computational antitrust and reporting might intersect in the years ahead. Nancy has spent her career covering technology and politics, and she brings a unique perspective on how institutions evolve or fail to evolve in the digital era. We explore what it all means for the future of computational antitrust. For the first time on the podcast, I am put in a position to interview a journalist/reporter. I am very much used to the opposite, so be sure that I enjoyed the experience, and I hope you will too, because it brings a very unique perspective on the subject to which we have dedicated already quite a couple episodes. Sit back and enjoy. All right. Thank you, Nancy, so very much for coming on the podcast. I think it's a first for me and potentially the very last time I will ever interview a reporter/journalist. Very much looking forward to our conversation. I've drafted a couple questions. It was a very unique exercise for me to come up with a bunch of questions I could ask, and I can't wait to hear from what you have to say. So what I've done is that I've divided the conversation in two different parts. First, I'd like to talk about the lessons that you've learned from your reporting on antitrust and see what it means for computational antitrust. And then in part two, I'd like to talk about computational antitrust and journalism. So if journalism could actually benefit from computational tools. But now, starting with the lessons from your distinguished career, you've spent most of your career reporting on the intersection between technology and politics, and you covered antitrust quite extensively. What's the one story or case that you covered you think computational antitrust researchers should dig into and maybe have not done yet?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Thibault. I really appreciate it. I feel bad I've ruined it already for future journalists that that you won't have them on. So thank you. Yeah. So the one thing that pops into mind in terms of what we could use computational antitrust techniques to better understand, both as a journalist, as regulators, as people grappling with some of these topics, is dynamic pricing. This is all the rage in American antitrust circles, understanding how companies are using specialized pricing for different customers as they sell their products. It is a poorly understood process as much as we talk about it, as much as we're seeing new cases pop up in American antitrust agencies around dynamic pricing. We don't have a really good grasp of how it works. And one of the examples that comes to mind is Delta recently talked about, we're going to use AI to offer customized pricing for airline tickets to some of our customers. To put it colloquially, people in the United States freaked out about this, said this is a real abuse of AI, and you're going to be extracting as much money possible from different customers in a way that's unfair. Delta said, you're completely misunderstanding how dynamic pricing works. These topics are becoming more and more of interest to antitrust regulators, and to equip them with the tools to be able to understand, okay, what is actually happening? What might we find objectionable? What might not just be objectionable? I think would be particularly interesting. And I think we're seeing that happen a lot in the airline industry. When you talk to experts in the antitrust world, you probably well know, they say the airline industry is always the canary in the coal mine. We see pricing practices start in the airline industry. If they work out pretty well, they spread to the rest of the American economy. And so to help them understand how the practices work early on, I think would help regulators for kind of decades to come. So I would love to see some of these tools applied to that field in particular.
Yeah, that would be great. I have many points with them, so I'm afraid I can't criticize Delta on this podcast because I don't downgrade it.
They'll take them. They'll take them away.
No, hopefully not. What they do in the US and what they never do in the EU is that they will upgrade you if there are free seats and if you have enough points, which never happens in the EU. Anyway,
Yeah. Honestly, airline points, I'm fascinated by airline points. It's a slightly tangential connection to the dynamic pricing, but how those points programs work is not entirely clear. And I've written a bit about the Department of Transportation trying to revive their competition enforcement work. And one of the things they're looking at is points programs because it's pretty opaque. But the value of a point can fluctuate. It's not quite clear what you're getting from one company versus another company. So applying your smarts to those programs too, I think would be of interest to regulators here.
yeah, and the lock-in effect are massive, at least as far as I'm concerned. There's no way I'm going to fly with another company outside of the group.
Yeah, and you probably know this, but people talk about why we don't see airlines pop up. Some of the folks look at that and say part of it is because you're so locked into an airline, you're not going to try a new one. And the relationships they have, we're getting off topic a little bit, but the relationships they have with banks, they're so locked in. Delta's so locked in, whatever their banking partner is, that it's really difficult for a new airline to start up and get that sort of preferential banking relationship.
Yeah. So talking about banks and now moving on to institutions, you've often emphasized in your work that institutions lag behind technological change. Which institution, whether it's US Congress or antitrust agencies or courts, or maybe another one that doesn't come to mind, which do you think seem most open to reinventing themselves for the digital era?
Just a little bit of background. I got my start in Washington working on Capitol Hill. In a previous life, I was a congressional staffer and saw how technology was and wasn't being used in Congress. It's certainly through a lot of effort of a lot of people gotten better in the last couple decades, but Congress really still struggles with modernizing. And part may well be obvious to listeners, but part of that is because there are more than 500 separate offices on Capitol Hill. So for anything to change, it takes a lot of different offices to buy in. There's these sort of separate fiefdoms with separate budgets. And so really to make institutional change is a real challenge. So Congress, God bless them, they're trying. It's really hard to make a lot of progress there. The courts, I'm so sorry about the courts. They culturally have tended to lag on adopting new digital technologies. Part of that, I think, they talk about the need for explainability, right? You can't have courts making decisions on things and then not being able to explain to the public the decisions they've made. So they emphasize that when they say we're going to slow down on adopting new technologies. The court recently, I think it was Chief Justice Roberts said that the idea of cameras in the Supreme Court is just never going to happen. So stop getting us to try to adopt that. But the agencies, I think, have a lot of potential, and the antitrust agencies, so the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, I think there's a lot of potential there because you have a lot of institutional knowledge that at least until recently tended to stay in place. You had people working in FTC, DOJ Antitrust Division for decades, right? That was perfectly normal to spend a few decades working on these places. That's changed a little bit with this new administration, but there's the time to try out some of these technologies and make gains there. And there's a little bit of money. They're always resource constrained, but they have a budget. They tend to have a similar budget year to year, so they can invest in projects and get them adopted that way. So that's where I think the agencies, there is the potential of, if some of these new approaches prove fruitful, there's a chance to get them adopted and really integrated into the workflow of these places. We can talk about this maybe, but the integration bit of it is a big challenge. I found in my reporting that even where we have in, say, the Federal Trade Commission, they open up to some fanfare, there's also Office of Technology under Chair Lena Khan and the Biden administration, getting them integrated into the workflow of the agency more broadly is a little bit of a hassle. They have to get pulled in by lawyers. The lawyers have to know that they need these tools that these technologists can offer. So getting that sort of baked into the day-to-day practice of these agencies is going to be hard. There's a lot of institutional momentum or inertia in the way that things have been done in the past, but at least the potential's there. I would actually, part of the reason I was hoping to join you today is I'd love to get your perspective. If you think, looking at some of these agencies, I have seen that there's a lot of talk, a little bit less real sort of points on the board in terms of these technological adoptions, but I know what I know as a reporter, but I was curious too what your perspective might be on that.
Yeah, maybe just one thing you've mentioned, which is very interesting to me. So the use of tech that could create a black box and then the need to justify the decision. it could be, of course, a perfectly valid reason not to use technology if you are using it for decision-making purposes. However, if you use it for the purpose of sorting out documentations or more basic tasks, then it does not create such a risk. So you have a whole chain of decision-making, and not everything is as risky as the final say as to whether a company is guilty or not. But when it comes to the design, so far what I see is that there are no best practices or general way of implementing that technical expertise within agencies. Some of them try to integrate it within the whole decision-making mechanism of the agency. Most of them, they just create a unit. And indeed, the case handlers, they have to be aware that the unit exists and could actually provide them with something helpful, as opposed to being the geek somewhere in a closet that you will never talk to because your job is complicated enough. Therefore, why would you? So it seems to me that there is a need for research there in trying to see what works in terms of integration, what doesn't. And of course, I suspect that you won't find a single best solution, but patterns at the very least.
It seems this might be naive to say, but it seems like what would need to happen to get real adoption in the United States is for this to work in practice. In that kind of goes without saying, but to go to court and say, we were able to harness a lot more data than we've been able to do in the past and make more sense of it than we've been able to make sense of it in the past, and convince a judge to take the enforcement action that we want them to take. And I think that would be the reaffirming use case, so that people in the agency, your colleagues at the next desk over, and say, how did you do that? I want to do that on my case. And then we're seeing some really interesting stuff on that front. The Knight Foundation here in the United States put a lot of money into their tech policy work. One of the things they're doing is looking at these antitrust cases across the United States, courts across the United States. What is persuasive? What do judges in their final decision say, okay, this data that the regulators or third parties provided me, that convinced me, and this stuff wasn't worth the time and effort put into collecting it. We saw in the Google search case that Yelp, which Yelp has been sort of Google's antagonist in these antitrust cases for a long time. One of the things they were able to really do is to collect data, package it, analyze it, package it in ways that were persuasive, first to the antitrust enforcers, and then potentially you can argue about this, but potentially to some extent with judges, right? That was a real win to say, we're not just complaining about Google because they're being mean to us. We're complaining about Google because if you look at the data, they're actually engaging in some bad practices. But they also lost. Well, they didn't. The case was not super successful for them.
Yeah.
So I think if you win something and then you go back to your bosses and say, this was like really useful, and then they say, okay, everybody else start doing it, that's where it's going to take hold.
Yeah. And it seems to me the DOJ had a very strong advocate in the person of Susan Athey, who has been very well known before joining the DOJ for the use of AI in providing economic evidence. And actually, in one of our conferences, she made a point that, in her view, it is easier to convince a judge using machine learning because there is less human intervention. She was a bit more nuanced, but pretty much that was the point. Therefore, less opportunities for a judge to question what you've done to the machine, in a sense, as opposed to using econometrics where you would intervene more and therefore give room to challenge as to what you've done.
Do you find that in the minds, I was talking about this topic with someone who is on the left side of the antitrust spectrum in the United States, this sort of neo-Brandeisian revival of antitrust, whatever you want to call it. We were talking about this idea of computational antitrust, and they said, we don't even trust the economists. We don't trust econometrics. We're not going to start dabbling in this AI stuff. Do you think in people's minds that they combine those two, of using like really sophisticated modeling and that sort of thing, and then the computational antitrust analysis, like those are the same sort of smoke and mirrors, and we're not going to bother with that? Is that firmly in people's minds, or is not? That's trying the tables and questioning you, but
yeah, I haven't heard much of that.
Yeah.
We've actually published papers on the differences between the two and how you produce evidence, so that seems to be clear.
Yep.
I've also seen that, depending on the jurisdictions, that if a judge has a very strong tendency to accept AI evidence as being the truth because it is AI, then I suspect this feeling of we won't bother actually will go away very soon if your opponent are doing it. So in some jurisdictions, it seems to be very true. And it seems that judges will be very much impressed by the fact that you've used AI. In some other jurisdictions, it will be the exact opposite, where they would say, nah, black box issues, explainability, transparency, I'm not going to rely on any of that. And maybe the United States so far is more in this category, but
yeah.
this is almost like a cultural debate.
Yeah.
Something that escapes my expertise.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, so we talk about, so indeed the agencies, do you see that the support for computational antitrust has been stronger under one of the recent US administrations or not necessarily?
I think I mentioned that in the Biden administration, in the FTC, they opened this Office of Technology, invested in it, hired some well-credentialed people, qualified people to run it. So I think there was, on paper, a lot of interest in the idea of we don't have the technological capacity to be able to confront some of these questions that are popping up in antitrust, and we need to get there. So there was definitely that sort of investment in we need to use technology to better understand technology, I think was a core talking point of the Biden administration. I think there was some skepticism of the idea of if the assumption was we need to go back to old school ways of thinking about antitrust in the Biden administration, we've gotten a little bit too fancy with this economic analysis. I think there was a cultural skepticism about some of this computational antitrust. I think in the Trump administration, in the first few months, the idea of using advanced techniques, using AI to better understand some of the big questions facing the country was all the rage, right? That was like the idea of going into the Department of Education and analyzing what schools across the country were doing using AI. People couldn't get enough of that, right? That was a big push of the early Trump administration. I think some of that burned off with Elon Musk's dipping into Washington and dipping back out. The idea that that's how you're going to solve some of the problems of the country. I think that the shine has come off that a little bit. I do think that there's a little bit more openness to AI as a concept in Trump era Washington, right? There is some more comfortability with using some of these tools in the work of government. But part of the challenge is you have the Andrew Ferguson, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, talks about we need to be better able to grapple with big data. This is how we're going to fight some of these big tech cases and win. He has talked about that. He's asked for more funding to be able to fund some of that work, the big data analysis work. At the same time, he's asked for less money for the agency across the board. The big push is how do we get rid of some of the headcount at the Federal Trade Commission? That's the way when the Republican administration these days is like shrinking your agency. And so I think the idea of there's a lot of cultural buy-in to the idea that this is how we need to upgrade and get high tech with the way that we approach government. I think the idea of cutting off a lot of the talent pipelines, funding for the folks that might do this work, I think it potentially could limit the sort of the actual implementation of some of these techniques. So I do think there's a lot more openness than there was in the last 4 years. I don't know if there's there might be diminished capacity to actually do that work.
Yeah, and then we're going to get to the modeling questions as to how many people with technical expertise do you need to hire, and on the short, medium, long term, is it more expensive actually for you to use that tech than not using it at all? It seems to me that no agency has come up with a perfect modeling as to exactly how much technology they need to deploy for that purpose.
Yeah.
So it seems that they are finding their ways as we speak.
Yeah. And I've written a lot about government technology in the past. And part of the challenge is people are in office 4 years. They're getting funding for IT projects for 4 years from a Congress that thinks in 2-year cycles. And some of these projects, it goes without, some of these projects could take a decade to transition over to more technologically advanced ways of doing things. So the model of how we buy and build technology in Washington just really doesn't match up with the ability to buy and build sophisticated technology. So that's an enduring challenge, but it seems also a challenge here.
Yeah, and on top of that, of course, then you have to design the legal regime, right? So it's not just that you can use technology, but that it is admissible before the court, convincing. Yeah. So yeah, that requires even more expertise and funding potentially. Yeah.
And how much transparency I'm sorry to interrupt, but how much transparency does there need to be around? How much do you have to tell a court of how you've analyzed this data?
Exactly. And if you don't have the legal standards, then how do you manage that? So if it's not exactly clear whether or not you should store the data, probably you should, to what extent, and the weight of the model you've been using to come up with a decision and the granularity level in the absence of a clear decision from the Supreme Court. I'm thinking Daubert, 1993 for economic evidence, in the absence of something similar for computational evidence.
Yeah.
It creates uncertainties for agencies, and this is costly as well.
Yeah. And I would have, just going back a little bit to the agency adoption stuff, I think you look at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division as potentially a place that really would be into experimenting with some of these approaches. Gail Slater, who's the assistant attorney general for antitrust, she was early on, before she came to DOJ, was very into the idea of what is the role big data plays in some of these technology company cases in particular. And she wrote a piece a handful of years ago saying why big data is a big deal, something like that, about how when you're looking at Google, she worked on the Google case way back when she was a staffer at the Federal Trade Commission a decade ago. And looking at the role that data plays in some of these cases, she was very early on the idea of we're missing a lot of the challenges, a lot of the potential sort of legal points that you could bring into court against a company like Google if we're not making sense of all the data that's involved in some of these cases. So she really could have, when I heard that she was going to be the next attorney general for antitrust, I thought, okay, that's somebody who really grasps the technology and is going to focus on implementing their work. She has run into a lot of challenges running that division around just the politics of some of that work. So I don't know that she's spending her days necessarily thinking about computational antitrust, where she may have in a more settled administration.
So what about the other way around? What about using computational antitrust in order to prevent regulators overreach, to take down regulatory barrier, to use it against government and governmental intervention that may reduce competition? Is that a thing? Have you had discussion in this space? Or
Yeah, the one thing it makes me think about is the Federal Trade Commission now has this case against Amazon on what they call dark patterns. The idea of when you go to the Amazon website, how it's designed in certain ways to encourage you to buy from a particular seller or not. All the sort of like little nudges they engage in on the user interface front to get you to behave in ways that maybe are anti-competitive. So particularly third-party sellers on the platform. They also look at the ways that Amazon makes it challenging, according to antitrust enforcers, make it challenging to cancel from Amazon Prime. Amazon, in this case, which is not surprising, says you're completely misunderstanding the cancellation process, how we engage with third-party sellers on our platform, every aspect of the Amazon business. And it's that case, you can look at it, people look at that case and say there was like a catchy term, dark patterns. The FTC under Chair Khan really wanted to bring a case on that front, and they plucked Amazon out because it's a big name and are trying to apply that this new shiny new theory to a big company and make some headlines with it. And it's one of those, I'm a journalist and I'm a journalist of the flavor that I have no personal opinions, but you can look at it and say, we don't really know if antitrust enforcers are overreaching in this case. Ultimately, it'll be up to a judge, but by the time it's up to the judge, there's a lot been invested in this case. That I feel like if there was a little bit more of, especially as like third parties could use some of these tools to say, okay, we have all this data potentially from Amazon or collected by third-party researchers, to really look at that and say, okay, no, how are people canceling? When people express an interest in canceling, are they actually successful in that process? And if they are, then maybe this is a little bit of overreach. We don't have that, right? As a reporter, it's FTC says Amazon's terrible. Amazon says FTC is completely misunderstanding. There's not a lot of ability for us to make too much sense of that. We rely on academics to do that work. But that's where I could look at that and say, okay, the company just accusing enforcers of overreach, which they're always going to do, how justified is it? I could see some of those tools helping us make some sense of that earlier on in the process.
Yeah. And at the very least, the FTC strategy was amusing to some, because a very famous paper published in 2017 argued that Amazon was actually engaging in predatory pricing, meaning prices that are too low. And the case is saying the opposite, right? They overcharge customers by forcing them to take on Amazon Prime and not being able to unsubscribe. It seems that there is maybe a contradiction in terms of two different strategies. If that is indeed the issue, and potentially or not a dark pattern in how you are forced to subscribe to Prime and how then hard it is for you to unsubscribe, I must say that I've seen way worse, right? I've seen newspapers and services where you can subscribe by the click of a button and then you have to call them about 10 times to unsubscribe, which is not my Amazon experience. But let's see what the court will say indeed. Now,
there was this is maybe off topic, but when this case came out and the New York Times wrote sort of Amazon's engaging in this behavior and with a certain tone of Amazon's abusing its customers. And people looked up at how difficult was it to cancel the New York Times.
Yeah, indeed. So now, so that case is a good example of what I want to talk about next. So journalists and regulators and academics, we face the same problem to some extent, which is that we have a lack of access to key platform data. And when we talk about that case about dark patterns, all we can say is maybe, and even sometimes after the decision is published, especially when it comes to merger control, I'm always amazed that people have very strong opinion as to whether a merger is good or bad, when in fact, I know it requires millions of documents and very complex analysis.
Yeah.
So because we have this lack of access to key data,
Yeah.
if you could, by the click of a button, compel disclosure to some part of the data sets, what would you do and why?
It's funny, I'm a tech policy reporter, I'm also a politics reporter, right? So one of the, on the part of what I think is very interesting political question in the United States right now is the idea of platforms and content and the decisions that are being made about how content is handled, right? We talk about content moderation on a platform like X or Facebook or Texas, somewhat separate case, because at least as of now, it's not an American company, but about how that content is handled. And it's often talked about in this sort of one-off case of what gets pulled down or not, right? These sort of high profile, there's a story about Hunter Biden, it gets taken down. We focus on this one-off cases where some of these platforms are obviously making complex decisions day in, day out about what sort of content to promote, demote, amplify on certain parts of the site and de-amplify on other parts of the site, that sort of thing. And it has real political consequences because a lot of our political debate in the United States happens on some of these platforms. And so you might look at that, and I think you as an expert in the field might look at that and say that's not an antitrust question. It's being treated as an antitrust question in the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. They very much look at content moderation and say, this is a competition question. If these platforms don't get better at it in the way that we think they should get better at it, we're bringing our forces to bear on them, antitrust enforcement forces to bear on them. So I would love to have, we don't really understand how these platforms make content moderation and content weighting decisions. I would love to have the capacity. If something happens in the news, how is Elon Musk's X handling the discussion of a certain topic, right? The murder of Charlie Kirk recently in the United States, what decisions were being made about what to promote and demote on that front. So it's very much a black box at this point. I don't know if even if they pulled back the lid of the black box, if we would be able to make sense of it. But at the moment, we just have we're experiencing it like everyone else, right? Sitting in front of our computer and saying, it seems like I'm getting a lot more violent videos of someone's murder. And certainly researchers look at that, right? It's not like we're all just going on vibes, but we don't have a real thorough way of understanding how those decisions are being made. And they're very consequential as political questions, and then consequential as potentially antitrust questions, because we've certainly seen enforcers being willing to go after these companies on some of that decision making.
Yeah, one follow-up question. I just landed in Belgrade last week, just 30 minutes after he was murdered. And I went to X and quickly realized that if I were to stay there for a couple more minutes, I would get to see the actual video close up, which I didn't want to see.
Yep.
So I had to, as a way to protect myself, get off the platform. But don't we know about X moderating strategy? I thought they released the code and everything was in the known. Is it not the case?
Is that my understanding? It's a constantly changing situation over there. Yeah. It's not my understanding that we have a real strong sense. But I mean, that, not to defend myself, but if I don't know how to access that information, it's potentially not. I don't know. It's interesting. I used to cover, when I was a beat reporter working on this, it was what decisions X made on political ads or particular pieces of content was all I was doing. There's a reason I don't do that anymore. Yeah. But no, that's interesting. If they made sort of real strides in opening that up, that'd be interesting to see.
Yeah. Okay, taking a step back and then we move on to part two, but looking at all the stories you covered over the years, what is the main lesson history gives us for computational antitrust?
The lesson that a little bit more?
From all the cases, all the stories, all the discussions you had, if there is one thing for the future of computational antitrust that we should take with us, what would it be?
I think part of it is there's a lot of ways to tell stories from data. And so And the way people at the end of the day are persuaded of things is through stories, right? We look at the Google search antitrust case that recently the judge made a ruled on that. He could have gone either way, right? He could have told a story about being aggressive and forcing Google to sell off Chrome.
Right.
He told a story, a little bit of judicial humility that a judge that would be going too far to make some of those more aggressive remedy decisions. So the idea of computational antitrust techniques being more baked into the system, it seems like there's a lot of potential for getting folks better able to grasp some of these more complex antitrust challenges that are facing enforcers and the like. Then you still have to tell the story, right? That there still has to be the convincing people of the rightness of this interpretation, and then telling a sort of narrative story about how it helps explain the world. I think sometimes we see the idea of, I've added some AI to this thing, and that's the be all and end all. And it's still, I think, somebody who sells stories for a living, maybe this is self-interested, but the ability to actually tell stories from that data, I think, is still going to be like enormously important. So I think you might see regulators who are good at that, right? Who say, here's the data, we made some real good sense of it, here's how it helps explain the world. I think that would probably be particularly persuasive.
Yeah, so officials from the CMA, so the competition agency in the UK, have told in our events that's indeed something they used internally in order to get more budget and more funding. So they were able to go to the head of the agency and to say, that's the story, that's what we've been able to achieve, this is very tangible, therefore please give us more money. And as far as I can say, that's been pretty effective. That's a perfect bridge to part 2 of the conversation, in which I want to talk about computational antitrust and antitrust journalism on the other end, and how one benefit the other. As we just discussed, it seems to me that journalism typically captures stories through individuals and narratives, while computational antitrust thrives on patterns in large data sets.
Yeah.
Now, I can make a case that one benefit from the other, and that indeed, if you can actually, thanks to journalism, create a story or put into context and perspective computational antitrust, this would benefit the field. Do you approach your job this way? Is it something you are interested in? Do you disagree with me? What's your take?
I would love to approach my job that way. I think I referenced this earlier, the idea that a lot of the reporting that we do when I write about antitrust is the sort of they said reporting, right? It's the enforcers say one thing, the company or whatever the other entity is another thing, and we don't feel super comfortable adjudicating that dispute. And not that we should be adjudicating that dispute, but being able to put it in context is, I think, where antitrust reporting really needs to go. Because I think it can be unsatisfying to normals, right? To people are steeped in the field. You can write about the sort of latest development in a particular case, and they appreciate it. These things are one of the reasons I spend some time writing about antitrust. It's important, right? It's very consequential. We sometimes don't do a great job explaining to people the stakes of some of these cases in particular. And I think we mentioned the dark patterns case, right? There's a lot of people use Amazon. A lot of people have particular opinions about their experience with Amazon. And we don't do a great job of saying, okay, here's what you're seeing as a consumer, as a user of this platform. Here's what some of the business decisions that were baked into that experience. Here's why this looks this way. And it changed 6 months ago because of this court decision in the EU or whatever it is. Being able to tell those stories in a way that's not just the adversarial enforcer says X and company says Y. I would love to do that. I would love to be able to write, and I've tried this a little bit, about dark patterns, like what is really happening there. I think we'd have a lot more readers for antitrust journalism if we were able to do that.
So I was about to say, and maybe this is my wrong understanding of it, but it seems to me, not being an expert, that journalism would indeed publish very timely pieces just the day after the decision is published, with maybe a word from the judge or the enforcer and the agency and the lawyers. And reporting is more into going into the deep questions and trying to get like the real story behind, and gives more time. And you've published many of those pieces. So would you say, if this is correct, that computational antitrust may be more helpful in the context of reporting as opposed to antitrust journalism?
I think some of the investigative techniques where we get journalism that gets real traction in the world is when we spend months on things and we've invested a lot of time and resources. We have investigative techniques to write about a lot of different topics.
Mm.
I don't know why I teach on this topic, so it just popped into my head, but the Me Too journalism there were some real techniques, right, around sexual harassment and abusive practices in various industries. There was some early work on that front, investigative work, really developed a body of knowledge about how you investigate those cases and then write those stories, right? There became a pattern about how you investigate and write a Me Too story. And that was super effective, and it was fair, and it was good journalism. But there was some new techniques, right? Like you looked at the non-disclosure agreements, how you could use that to reconstruct what was happening in an industry. Reporters shared that work amongst themselves and learned from it. On the antitrust side of things, I think it would be enormously fruitful for everyone to spend more time putting in that effort to tell those long-term stories in a way that captures the public's imagination. But that can't be the party A says one thing and party B says the other. Nobody's going to read that at some point. The Google search decision, right? Pretty consequential, came out. You had the first day story, maybe a second day story talking about what it means. And then it's as if it never happened, right? Potentially there's a lot more that could be written about that. But that's probably going to be a book, right? That'll be a book, and that'll be a day one story. But the longer term reporting, the more narrative reporting in the middle, we don't tend to do. So I think that could really benefit from there's three experts involved, right? There's the enforcers, there's the company or whoever other entity is, and then the journalists being able to make sense of this. We're really good at that in some fields. We're not great at that, I would argue, in antitrust yet.
But are you not doing it because it takes slightly longer than what an outlet may want? Therefore, by accelerating work a little bit using computational tools, you think it could actually get closer to being done, or is it not the issue?
I think it's part of we talked about courts have to not reproduce their work, but courts have the explainability, I think, is if we're not comfortable enough with these techniques, the explainability even to our editors isn't there. We're just not going to put in the effort. If we can say, because we're always worried about getting conned by a source, right? If we're not if we have to rely on other researchers, we might use them as a voice in a story, but it's not going to help us build the framework first. So I think it's less I have time to work on stories. I can spend months on a story but it's the comfortability with some of these approaches, I think, isn't there yet.
Yeah, I want to talk about that next. But first, another magical question. What computational tool would you like to have but do not have yet in order to benefit your reporting? So is there any stories you covered recently where you were like, if I had that, or if I could do that, or process this data, it would have been amazing?
So I don't know what I don't know, but the one case that I think is so interesting, I think there'd be an audience for reading about it, but I don't know how to make sense of it, is the Live Nation Ticketmaster case. Americans buy concert tickets. They're horrified by I think it's probably fair to say horrified by the concert ticket buying experience.
Yep. I know people fly to Europe because it's still cheaper on average.
It is literally, I know it's going to get your teeth done in a different country because it's just simpler or whatever, or plastic surgery. It's enormously frustrating to people. You have the money, you want to go see Taylor Swift or whoever it is, and you can't get a ticket. People find that very frustrating. And that's a story that's not simply about pricing. It's not about just dynamic pricing. It's a relationship between the ticket seller, the venues, the artists who are bound by these contracts, how those contracts have geographic limitations, right? You can go play in Baltimore, but you can't play in DC. And people would read that, right? Because I'm living in DC, I have money to go see Taylor Swift, and can't figure out a way to functionally go see Taylor Swift. People would read that. That's it. It is a tough story to tell. I've actually attempted to get editorial interest in telling that.
Yeah.
But it becomes it's either is a complicated story to be able to tell it simply. We need better tools to understand some of those dynamics. So I think potentially if you had all the data, if I was comfortable in those techniques, to be able to say, this is how that market is shaped. Here's the impact it has on you as a normal person trying to go see a show. I think that's good journalism. It's service journalism, and people would read it.
Yeah. So there is a need for technical expertise in order to first use it, maybe convince a editorial board. And you may also see that in investigating what regulators are doing with it. And we talked about it. That's the black box issue.
Yeah.
Do you think that reporters and journalists in this space are well equipped with this technical expertise to deep dive into computational tools, or do you see that as a risk for the profession?
I think antitrust reporters, and I do more narrative journalism, so I only dabble in the sort of nitty gritty of antitrust journalism. They're some of the best reporters going. They are skilled, well-versed in the topic, dedicated. They tend to be terrific. More and more, they're behind a paywall, and the public is not getting access to their journalism, right? It's people who are willing to pay pretty high dollar to get access to the journalism. I think that's perfectly understandable given the market forces in journalism right now, but it's a real shame because these cases and questions are so enormously consequential for the future of this country, and people are getting very limited access to that journalism. So I think antitrust trade reporters perfectly capable of adopting new tools and approaches. The impact that's going to have on what the general public is consuming about some of these topics, I worry about that. And part of that is those are the people who are going to be funded to do some of this more complex work. And the more that these techniques might take more investment resources, and traditionally you might have had that at other publications. More and more, that's just not the case.
Yeah. Okay, talking about the future, and this will be potentially my last question.
Okay.
10 years from now, do you imagine a computational antitrust journalist being a job description where you see someone that covers algorithmic enforcement like we have today, financial journalist that covers financial markets, or not?
I don't imagine you would. We had this sort of real excitement around hiring data journalists for a while. Every publication needed to hire 5 data journalists. I think what people found was that data journalism was a tool in the tool set and not necessarily something you just kept segregated to a handful of reporters that sat in the corner. I think the challenge and the expectation is if your story involves data, you make an effort to understand that data. Maybe you pull in somebody who has a little more expertise, who's another reporter or an editor to work that into your story. So it's not that work shouldn't be done, but it's just a little bit more baked into the general reporting process and approach. I think antitrust reporting is already niche. I think the idea of having computational antitrust reporters is probably too niche, but getting it baked into, especially publications that focus a lot on business journalism, having it be part of the skill set of people who are good at working with data, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I can't. I'd be curious it doesn't seem to me that would be with jobs dwindling in journalism, that would be
the thing I don't know is whether when a big publication hires a antitrust journalist, whether they say you'll cover big tech kind of stuff and you'll do key infrastructures and you'll do something else, agriculture, or whether you are hired and can potentially cover anything that is antitrust related.
I think in the trade publications, there are specific people who cover agriculture, people that cover technology. I think the bigger publications, you are a tech report. I know tech reporting best. You're a tech reporter. Part of the tech story right now is antitrust.
Yeah.
It's not, it's more subject matter focused. And then wherever the antitrust story pops up, it pops up.
Yeah. Okay. Let me do something to end the conversation. I'm going to ask you a question and then I will try to free jazz based on your answer and see what it means for computational antitrust.
Yeah.
So in a decade from now, what would you expect be the most important story at the intersection between big tech companies, regulation, and competition?
So you mentioned this 2017 paper about Amazon that made a big splash. Part of it got Lina Khan eventually made chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Part of the excitement around that was we looked at this company, Amazon. It seemed different from other companies, and we weren't totally sure why. What was it about the sort of and she wrote, and the reason that paper got a lot of traction, she wrote about Amazon as sort of an ecosystem, right? It's not just a platform that sells its own products. It's not just a platform that works with third parties to sell products. And now I sometimes joke that Amazon is baked into every aspect of my life. At some point, I attempted to cancel Prime for my own personal reasons, and my world just broke down. Like nothing worked. It's like I couldn't get grocery delivery at Whole Foods. I believe iRobot, my Roomba is now owned by Amazon, baked into. And we tend to think in the antitrust world for good reason. There's this thinking about vertical mergers, horizontal mergers, right? Get that antitrust lawyers think about a world for good reason in a very legal way. The public's understanding of what happens when you have a company that owns your online retail and your grocery store. Oh, and also One Medical. That's also owned by Amazon right now. Is where I get some of my health services is through Amazon. Two, of understanding, this is a lot of words to say. We don't totally understand these markets in which you might have a company that is a conglomerate, and not in the traditional way that a conglomerate was just two companies bolted together that do very different things. There is some crossover between One Medical is now on the Amazon platform, right? I'm sharing logins between those platforms. Between those two kind of subsidiaries or however they structure them. So it's, again, a long way of saying we don't understand what it means when companies are engaged in overlapping markets in a way that impacts the way that Americans experience those products. And I think being able to better understand, again, Lena Khan made her name explaining Amazon as an ecosystem, being able to understand in the future, Google is both your search engine, but it's your AI product. It's maybe the platform that your kid uses at school to access all their online learning resources. Being able to better understand where all those overlaps, the impacts that they really have. Again, maybe that's not for antitrust enforcers. They think about the world differently. Being able to explain some of these markets to the public. I think as a journalist, I think that'd be terrific if we were better able to do that.
Yeah, so I promise I will react and explore what it means for computational antitrust. I do supervise a PhD candidate on the concept of ecosystem in antitrust. She'll be very pleased to hear that you think it's their next big story coming.
I shall write about that person. No, I think, yeah.
So when it comes to computational antitrust, I can see so many use cases for defining markets, if that is still relevant concepts, if you want to measure innovation for the trade-offs. Maybe there are ways to compute that by using proxies within the ecosystem. But let me ask you a question. How different do you think that is, if it is, from, let's say, companies in the 50s and the 60s in the United States, where they will provide you not only with a job, but also a house. They will provide your kids with education, as far as I understand. They will maybe come to your place to make sure that you vote as you are supposed to vote. Isn't it also a conglomerate that resembles that we see today?
I think the sort of simplistic response is we talk a lot about big data, and we probably don't talk enough about big data in some ways. That is a different relationship where you have an Amazon being, if they become a dominant player in healthcare, a dominant player in the grocery space, and a dominant player in online selling, and are sharing that data amongst all those different entities. I think it potentially becomes a different experience for me as a consumer of those products. And if your face is skeptical, that's with good reason, because it's a different experience for me, I think, as a person on the other side of things than it would be if I simply look at the world and say, okay, I'm buying my car and whatever else it is from the same company. I think that's a slightly different. This is maybe sound a silly diversion, but I was recently at an antitrust conference, and there was a panel on which there was a local veterinary clinic owner. And he talked about how he's increasingly competing with clinics that are owned by the Mars Corporation. I'm not sure the exact name, but it's the Mars. And someone said, the candy bar folks? I said, oh, yes, they have Mars Pet Care as part of it. So that's I don't see a world necessarily in which those two things meet, which I'm buying a candy bar from a company and taking my cat to a clinic owned by that company. Okay, we get like global conglomerates, like that happens, where those parts are so interlocking and sharing data. I think certainly could be arguments disagreeing with me that make good sense, but the idea that's a different experience for me qualitatively as a person living in a world that's increasingly being managed by an Amazon that also has access to huge amounts of pretty consequential data, and I don't necessarily understand how they're using it. I think potentially that's something feels a little bit different than some of those old we've always had big companies, but it feels a little bit different.
Yeah, and antitrust enforcers, of course, the big question will be whether it's a bad feeling or a good one. It's all integrated, also creates consumer surplus and generates some benefits. So maybe to be waived against negative ones.
Yeah. I mentioned that my world breaking down when I canceled Amazon Prime.
Yeah.
It was funny. I lasted about 18 minutes, but I hadn't realized that you couldn't, at the time for Whole Foods, you couldn't book a pickup slot at a Whole Foods without Amazon Prime, which I was not clear on at the time. So even those things, I enjoy the lack of friction of being able to book a time to pick up
Yeah.
the virtue. So there's some upside there too.
Exactly. All right. And for that, you will need computational antitrust. Okay. Thank you so very much. It's been a very unique conversation. So thank you for coming on the podcast. I look forward to seeing what you'll publish next. And I'll hope to see you in person. I'll make it to DC probably in the coming weeks. So
Please do.
I'll be in touch.
Thanks, Thibault. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.